Greens leader Bob Brown says the government and the opposition have delivered a Polluters PayDay. He joins us in our Parliament House studio. Senator Brown, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
An extra $7 billion for industry. Is this worse than you anticipated?
Well, it's $7.7 billion, and on top of the $16.5 billion they had in the legislation the Rudd government had already put forward, this totals now some $24 billion of Australian taxpayers' money, effectively, that goes to the big polluters, and it's on the basis of the more you pollute, the more you get. And involved in yesterday's so-called compromise with the coalition is a transfer of $5 billion from Australian householders on the premise that they no longer need it, straight across to the coal miners and coal burners. It's absolutely a polluter's rort, manufactured by the big parties because of the lobbying system, which enables the big coal corporations, for example, 75% owned outside Australia, to get this massive windfall when they're the cause of the problem, at the expense of Australian households.
Polluters rort, perhaps, in the short term, but those supporting this scheme say it's going to be worth the cost to get a scheme in place, because unless you have a scheme in place, nothing can change. At least this gives an industry for framework to start dealing with their carbon emissions. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. Quite the contrary. This is a scheme for a 5% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2020. We know that locks in, if it's a prescription for the death of the Great Barrier Reef, the loss of our snowfields, the further drying out of the Murray-Darling Basin, as we've heard from scientists this morning, potentially a 2-metre sea level rise this century, affecting hundreds of thousands of businesses and households around the Australian coast, with many more $1 billion costs attached to that, simply because the government's not putting these billions into assisting households to transform across to insulation, solar hot water systems, and those businesses with renewable energy, which is not going to cause the massive penalty scientists are talking about. The solar-based industries, renewable energy efficiency are not getting the money. It's going to the polluters. That's very perverse. But
Senator Brown, a 5% cut in our emissions by 2020, that's the worst-case scenario. That's the minimum guarantee. Plenty of people are still hopeful that Copenhagen eventually, if not in December, but ultimately the globe will come to a better agreement than that, at least 15% cut. Then, if it's at that level, doesn't the government scheme start to look better? Don't the sums start to look better?
Well, no, it looks worse, Fran, because the 5% at the moment is a legislative maximum unless the rest of the world moves further. They can fall well below that. But if you go above that, then the polluters start getting many $billions more. And you start a potential of $12 billion if the target was to switch to 15%. And that hamstrings the government from being able to support the clean new energies and the research and development that Australia's been so good at it. And we've seen under the Howard government the transfer of fantastic solar technology to Berlin and Beijing and California. And this prescription we've got from the Rudd government is simply a follow-on. It's not getting behind those industries which would create jobs right across regional Australia, as well as in the manufacturing industries, and billions of dollars of export income. We're missing that opportunity, and our
Don't we have to do both, though, Bob Brown? Don't we have to, A, make sure we do secure the electricity supply, the energy supply for this country, and invest in renewable energies to make that transition? We have to massage this transition, don't we?
If you're going to, you absolutely, no, we have to be on the fast forward into renewable energy. But what the government's prescription, what the Kevin Rudd's prescription is doing here, is entrenching the old polluting industries as the basis for moving forward. And our legal advice is that if the government does move the goalposts in towards better action, then the polluters will have a constitutional basis for going for billions dollars, multi-billion dollars more. And so the government set in place so many penalty clauses aiding and abetting the big polluters that is going to hold back this country's transformation into a clean, green nation, leading the world to tackle dangerous climate change and giving security in the future. And as Sir Nicholas Stern said, if we don't transfer 1 or 2% of gross world product across to tackling climate change, our grandchildren, the people Kevin Rudd was talking about yesterday are going to have a 6 to 20% hit on their gross national product trying to deal with climate change.
So Nicola Stern also said the longer we wait, the more irrevocable it is and the more it's going to cost. Isn't that an argument for getting some scheme in now, even if it's not perfect?
Well, that's the longer we wait to do what the scientists are telling us we should do, and that's aim for a target of 40% or at least 25% if the rest of the world doesn't act. And that's where the Greens responsibly are going with the amendments we will be moving as the opposition, the constructive opposition for the Australian people in this debacle of legislation that the Rudd government's manufactured by going into an even worse polluters pay position with a fractured coalition. So we've got a government coalition nexus aiding and abetting the big polluters, with the Greens coming up with a constructive alternative. And this is evolutionary politics here. We're looking at a different economy, a clean green economy with a job-rich clean green economy and a much more secure future that the Greens are putting before the Parliament.
So are you saying we would be better off with no emissions trading scheme, no deal at all, than this one, and therefore what will you do when this comes into the Senate?
No, we'd be much better off with an emissions trading scheme which had an aim of a 25 to 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2020. But
let me rephrase that. We're going to vote. There's going to be a vote on this scheme perhaps on Thursday.
Oh, this scheme should be knocked out. It is such a polluter's paradise against the interests of the average Australian worker, the average Australian family, the average Australian household, and that includes rural and regional Australia. I can't believe that the National Party has gone so far in favour of the coal miners against the interests of farmers. But that's one of the other extraordinary outcomes here. It's left to the Greens to be promoting the interests of rural and regional Australia and to protect their interest against dangerous climate change. We've already seen the impact of drought on the Murray-Darling Basin, those worsening bushfires, the threat of storms, and we've got sea level rises now which are manifestly changing the coastline already. Well, the Greens are in action mode on this, and it's a constructive action that we're putting forward, while the big parties have gone to bolster the big polluters through multi-billion-dollar handouts.
Senator Brown, just finally, you've seen a lot of politics come and go over the years. What's your view of what's going on in the coalition? Do you think Malcolm Turnbull's leadership will survive? And if he is removed, then from your point of view, the outcome's even more bleak in terms of climate change, isn't it?
Well, the big parties are held back by a craven scepticism, which is just an excuse for not taking the courageous action that's required for the Australian people to prosper in the rest of this century. Look, that's up to them. All I know is we have a strong, united Greens alternative here, and we'll be going to the next election putting our much more economically sound, employment-producing, environmentally safe alternative to the Australian people. And the opinion polls show the majority of Australians want the politicians to act according to the scientific and economic alternatives which we have for this country. That's where the Greens will be appealing to the Australian people, if they want a better outcome in future years, to vote Green in the coming election next year.
Senator Bob Brown, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.